Hey everybody, I'd love to introduce David Victor from UCSD, well, in Brookings and Scripps, talking about, essentially how do we decarbonize the world and how do we model our way to understanding the impact of our actions? Well, welcome, David.
Excellent, Greg. Well, thank you very much for having me. Great to be with you. So I have about 40 minutes of content. You be the judge as to whether it's content, but 40 minutes of content and 20 minutes for Q&A, but I think we're going to do Q&A along the way, so we'll see how that evolves. So I'm a political scientist by training. Economists like to say that they're the dismal science because economics is about trade-offs. I think political science is the real dismal science because it's about why when societies face trade-offs, they consistently do the wrong thing. And for the last 15 years, I've been working on how to model doing the wrong thing and sometimes doing the right thing when it comes to deep decarbonization, and to think about what we as political scientists do systematically enough so that it can be turned into code and brought into models. That's what I want to talk about today. So the question that animates the talk today is, are there ways to improve the big energy system models, which are called integrated assessment models, IAMs, and then teach them about political economy, about how political and economic forces shape the kinds of policies that are adopted, where firms invest, and things like that. That's the big question that I've been working on for the last 15 years. I'm going to show you some illustrations of that today. Before I'm too critical of the integrated assessment models, first let me just say it's an extraordinary accomplishment. In the 1990s, the field of integrated assessment modeling basically didn't exist. Today, they're able to produce charts like this. This is a derivative of a number of the IPCC reports, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. One of the effects of the IPCC has been to get the IAM community, the integrated assessment modeling community, organized and together and running lots of scenarios. And there are now literally thousands of scenarios and databases and ways to compare them and do large statistical analysis on them. So it's an extraordinary contribution. And it is now the single most important model-based tool for assessing climate policy, I think, are the integrated assessment models. So I'm going to say some critical things about them today, but first I want to say a nice thing, which is it's an incredible accomplishment what the field has actually done. So how do we think through the question of how you would introduce more politics into these models? Because the typical model knows about the cost of generating energy of various types, the demand for energy, knows some stylized things about energy policies like carbon taxes and cap and trade, knows some things about investment, but in a very stylized way. And the simplification has been incredibly helpful because it's helped the community get itself organized. How can we do better and add some complexity to these models that are better reflective of reality? So one way to think about that is to look at how essentially all the integrated assessment models address the challenge of deep decarbonization. So big reductions in emissions, not 20, 30% reductions in emissions, shallow decarbonization, but deep decarbonization, 80%, 100% reductions in emissions, more than 100% reductions in emissions. How do they do that? And then we can look at those stylized results from all those models and say, where does politics affect those results? So basically, all these models to varying degrees do 6 things. One is they assume that policymakers impose some kind of a cap on emissions or a carbon tax or something like that, and that there's political support for that. The second is that most decarbonization comes from electrification. Academics and analysts are in the disagreement business. That's how we advance. But in the agreement business, essentially everyone agrees that deep decarbonization means electrification. You've had other talks in your series about that. That's the second point. The third point is that the energy system becomes a lot more capital intensive. So in effect, the energy system of today, which is already very capital intensive, becomes more electrified and even more capital intensive in the future. Many of the clean technologies have essentially no OPEX, they're all CAPEX, which means that they're very sensitive to the cost of capital, and they're very sensitive to the risk that once you sink the capital, you're not going to get repaid. New technologies come into service by assumption in some models, and some of the models have various kinds of algorithms that allow the technology to get better over time, learning by doing and things like that, and so on. And then if the climate goals are really stringent, the model freaks out and it can't solve. And so the way it solves is it says, hey, let's imagine technologies that pull carbon out of the atmosphere. And then finally, the models to varying degrees assume that everybody in the world does something about controlling emissions, and not every single country. I mean, there are different scenarios for that. So these are stylized. This is my view of what almost all the models say, and you may have your own list, which is fantastic. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to pick out a few of these along the way, and I'm going to show where and how we now have the capacity to introduce more politics in a systematic way. Why is systematic thinking important? Because we can't just say, hey, politics is important. We have to turn it into some kind of algorithm that can be brought into the model so that the model endogenizes some parts of politics or political economy in ways that make the model more realistic about what happens in the real world, and also makes the model therefore more useful for assessing future policies. So let me just point out that there's a paper, Wei Peng. I'm going to ignore all of the chat that's going on here right now, which I think is about people raising their hand and then having their hands lowered. But if there's a question, Greg, you'll interrupt me.
Yeah, I think it was Jeffrey that I did. Jeffrey, you had a question?
So sorry about that. I'm on a phone. I must have inadvertently raised it. So thank you for lowering that for me.
All right, awesome.
Thank you. Okay. So there's a paper that's out 5 years or so ago. Wei Peng is the lead author, but there's 10 of us who have been involved in various ways with energy system models or integrated assessment models, who laid out a roadmap, and the roadmap is still being used today for thinking about the strategy of bringing more political economy into these models. And on the horizontal axis is the tractability. To what degree can we actually model this political phenomenon or policy choices and so on? And the vertical axis is increasing importance. To what degree does this tell us something that's useful about how the world really operates and then allows us to do a better job of assessing policies? So in the ideal world, you want to be in the upper left-hand corner. You want things that are easy to do and really important. Those things tend to be done, and we're working on some of those. In the upper right-hand corner are really, really hard problems. So for example, varying the cost of capital, I'm going to talk a lot about. You could imagine a world where we did a much better job of assessing the cost of capital by technology and business model in different countries in the world. So basically bring a lot of finance into these models. Really hard to do that in a tractable way, but would be unbelievably important. So think of this as a kind of conceptual roadmap of the kinds of things that you might do. In the lower right-hand corner are the things that are a waste of time. So things that are really hard to do and not very valuable. And I want to just flag that uniform carbon taxes, which is the standard way that most of these models approximate climate policy, is a fun thing to think about, but almost totally irrelevant for real world policy analysis because almost nobody actually does it that way. So I guess that's conceptually where I'm headed. So here's the same slide that I had earlier, and I want to just highlight a few things that are right places for work and give you a few illustrations of things that we've been done. The single most important thing that I feel I've been working on with bringing a reality to integrated assessment models has been about capital intensity. What do we know about the cost of capital and how does that affect the results? Profoundly important, because if you think the energy system is becoming more capital intensive, it's going to be super sensitive to the cost of capital. And not just 1%, 2%, 3%, but sub-percent, half a percent, a quarter of a percent. You can have very, very different results. So the first time we worked on this is a group of modelers, mainly working with a model out of the University of Maryland and PNNL called GCAM. This is a paper that came out about 10 years ago, where we educated GCAM about the quality of political institutions around the world and therefore the cost of capital around the world. In general, places that have bad political institutions and bad financial institutions, the cost of capital is very high because risks are higher. And places that have good institutions where people are confident they're going to be able to enforce contracts, they're going to get repaid, the cost of capital is relatively low. Until this paper, the models essentially knew nothing about this phenomenon, which is common because they assumed the cost of capital was the same all around the world, which meant the way the models made big cuts in emissions in the most cost-effective manner is they identified the places that had the most inefficient energy systems, and they poured capital into those systems because those are the places with the low-hanging fruit as the model understood it. But if you think that those places also tend to have inferior political institutions and therefore higher costs of capital, then you end up with a completely different result. Let me show you the kind of iconic finding from that paper. So this chart shows you over the horizontal axis is the amount of emissions control that the model is asked to do. And the vertical axis is the cost. It's the carbon price you need to apply to the model in order to get that degree of emissions control. So think of this as a diagnostic. In the real world, you would not be just using carbon prices or carbon taxes. You'd be using industrial policy and all kinds of things like that. I'll talk about that in a little bit. But this is a pretty standard diagnostic for these models, where you say how sensitive is the model to a variation in the price of carbon, and how much emission reduction does it make. So the bottom line here is pointer caption here. Bottom line here is the standard model result, which is that the model thinks the cost of capital is everywhere, the risk by technology, the risk by country is all the same everywhere in the world, and it's relatively inexpensive to control emissions because the model can find an opportunity anywhere in the world and then invest in that opportunity. And as you ramp up, as you make the model more realistic, these different scenarios, as you, the different colored lines, and you tell the model more information about how some technologies are riskier than other technologies, how some countries are really risky compared to others. As you do that, emissions control becomes more expensive. And the other thing that I think is the most interesting result in this paper is that emissions control efforts shift away from the developing countries, where the energy systems are relatively inefficient, and in theory you think there's big opportunity to cut emissions, and they shift back to the industrialized countries, into China, places where the energy systems are already relatively efficient. And the reason they do that is because the cost of capital effect is greater than the lower cost of controlling emissions in an already inefficient economy. Now, this is a stylized result. Why do you care about this? You care about this because this is one way to think about how to make a model more reflective of real world variations in the cost of capital. And the logical way to kind of connect all those dots would be to link these models to information from the financial markets that would reveal things about the cost of capital. So that's one interesting direction. I should just mention, oh, go ahead, Greg.
Yeah, so this smells a lot like standard macroeconomic models, because they have no choice but to incorporate phenomena like this in them, and they have like these country level resolve dynamics. So how much of that is directly applicable as opposed to conceptually a decade? And just use those models as the macroeconomic core.
Yeah, you could. The challenge is you've got to get them in a reduced enough form to be able to have the model be tractable inside the large integrated assessment framework. So there could be there could be ways of generating stylized results from those standard microeconomic models that then the patterns could be then basically brought in to the integrated assessment models. That would be a very promising direction of research. But but your intuition, Greg, is exactly right.
Okay, awesome.
By the way, I should mention that when you look at this work was done 10 years ago, when you look at the actual deployment of capital, that's what we're seeing. So here are the new Bloomberg New Energy Finance data on clean tech investment that came out a couple hours ago. And what's interesting here is investment in clean tech in their broad definition of it. In the high income markets, by the way, look at the numbers here. High income markets in China, both, kind of $1 trillion scales, China just a little bit less. And the emerging markets, ex-China, are 1/3 those levels. So there's some standard results from the models without integrated assessment models, without knowing about the cost of capital and so on, would have almost an inverted result. You'd be over-investing in the emerging economies because they're already inefficient. We see a different result from theory that I was just talking about, and now you're seeing this, and you have actually seen this for a long time inside the data. Okay, I'm going to just say one more thing about this and then move on. Related to this is the question of how far into the future a model can look. If a model is investing in something that's capital intensive, then all else equal, if a firm that's able to look far down into the future and have some confidence in its ability to see the future could invest around those new realities and amortize the value of that investment over a long time horizon. So Valentina Bossetti, who's part of the team, an Italian team that runs a model called Which, and I wrote a paper where we said, where we made that a variable. We told them, we varied the extent to which the model has foresight about the future and confidence about what the future policy environment is going to be. And the circles that I'm going to show you here are proportional to the cost of meeting a climate goal. So if the model has perfect foresight, it can see a lot in the future, versus the model having basically no foresight whatsoever, it's kind of stumbling from solve period to solve period. There's a huge variation in the cost, which makes intuitive sense. Now you're seeing more models, not all of them, but more of the models, including this kind of foresight as a variable, because it's a proxy for the extent to which you're able to see into the future with some confidence and then invest inside that future. So this first kind of segment of my talk has been all about things that affect risk and confidence around the investment environment and reflected in part in the cost of capital and the huge impact that will have on model results. So second, I want to talk a little bit about political support. and I'm in a very stylized way saying here, the models assume political support. The modelers aren't idiots. They know that there's political support that varies all around the world. And so they run typically a whole lot of different scenarios about this. It's become very interesting to study the United States because of the variation in the federal level. So I want to show you results from one paper that came at Princeton and PNNL using GCAM, and I worked on a few years ago, where we said, well, suppose the federal government's flaky and they're basically absent from the scene. To what degree can state-led climate policies actually go off and fill in the gaps? In order to do that, you need to have some intuition around which states are going to do this and which states are going to be less interested in doing this. And so the way we did that is we went to the public polling data and we looked at polls that told us something about, and this study was done in 2018, you can imagine doing it today, where if anything, the federal government is even flakier when it comes to climate policy. We looked at which states have populations that are very strongly in favor of doing something about climate change, and then basically used that as an index to vary the extent to which the different states would adopt climate policies, which we reflected in the form of a carbon price or a carbon tax in different states, where the blue states have high carbon taxes and the red states have low carbon taxes. In our model, you can't give a carbon tax of 0 and get any meaningful climate goals because you have this leakage of investment to the places that do absolutely nothing. But we have a huge variation across the country. And the question we were interested in is, how second best are state-driven climate policies compared with an optimal federal policy? And the reason that question is interesting is that almost all the global models assume that countries are the unit of analysis, and therefore each country or each region of countries is adopting the optimal climate policies as needed to meet climate goals at the national level. And yet many countries, United States, India, many others, are federal systems where most of the variation is happening at the federal level. So here's a pretty a kind of strong result that's based on some assumptions, and I'll talk about those in just a moment, where we're comparing, in this case, for different decarbonization goals. That's the vertical axis, so it's 20% cut in emissions, 80% cut in emissions. And then the horizontal axis is cost, where we're using the fraction of GDP being spent on climate goals as a proxy for, as an indicator of cost. And we're comparing in each of these the difference between a uniform climate policy, the kind of policy that's assumed in most of the models, and a heterogeneous climate policy where different states do different things, and the extent to which they do things is indexed on the extent to which the population of the state cares about climate change. Now, I'm not sure I fully believe this result, but I'll tell you what it is, which is that there's very little difference, about a 10% difference in cost between the uniform policies and the heterogeneous policies. Why? Because in our model, you can trade electricity and you can trade clean molecules or biofuels, or not just biofuels, but clean fuels across state borders. And so a lot of the inefficiencies that would be created by a state-by-state approach get washed out, basically, because you can have trade across borders. And if we tighten that trade and restrict that trade, then the costs skyrocket. I would focus less on the particular result here and more on the key assumption that's driving it, which is the assumption around trade, in particular trade in infrastructure, because I think it has big implications for the way we think about our technological, our grid and the capabilities of the grid. And I live in California. We're perennially in conversations in California about how we can meet our clean energy goals by importing wind and other sources of electricity from other states. And all the models love building large transmission lines. The people through whom the transmission lines go, their backyards, don't like it. Organized labor doesn't like it for the most part. And so this is a kind of really interesting set of political questions that I think are going to be a frontier for. How does the geography of the infrastructure affect the cost of controlling emissions, especially when you have highly heterogeneous policies across different states? Now, I want to just pause for a second and see if there are any comments or questions before I go on and talk about I'm going to talk about 3 or 4 of these buckets in my remarks today. Greg?
Actually, I do have one right now. So you focus in U.S. states, but I think this is extremely salient across the world when you're thinking of developing versus developed countries. Most opportunity for decarbonization is in developing countries. Most of the money is in developed. Seems like an easy trade. So what is the implication globally?
Yeah, so it's a very easy trade. The trade you have to have a way to to bind the contract of the trade. People have to be confident that the trade is enforceable. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit later. So I'm going to come back to that very question there, because if you believe that international contracts can be enforced, then lots of cool things can happen. If you're not so confident in that, and there are a lot of reasons, especially today, where you should be less confident in that, then you end up with a very, very different policy strategy. So I'm going to come back and talk about that. So let me double click or unclick on one of the assumptions, which is I always assumed that developing countries were the place where we were going to invest. And it blew me away when we did that paper on the cost of capital and we educated the model about the variations in the cost of capital. You can do this also by looking at the sovereign bond market. So basically look at sovereign risk as a proxy for risk in different countries, which varies, hundreds of basis points across different countries. And when you do that, the model just does not find that. The model finds that actually the big opportunities for cutting emissions, you can't ignore the developing countries, but the big opportunities are in the places where you can do capital intensive long-lived deals. So that to me is a really interesting result. Okay.
Let me ask you that, because it just came up. So if this occurs, if you have a largely correlated risk, definitely, but if you have a largely uncorrelated risk that you can diversify away, does that undo the high, like if the risk of the high risk countries are different from each other, does this undo this effect?
It could undo this effect. To me, the correlation that's most interesting though is the high correlation, and I don't have the data with me, we spent some time with this some years ago, is the high correlation between the inefficiencies in the energy system and the cost of capital, reflected, for example, in sovereign risk. And that correlation then is really what's doing a lot of the work here. So it's hard. But the place that I think is really interesting is the possibility for firms that are operating inside countries that have lots of risk to insulate themselves from that risk. For many years, and not true anymore, for many years, Pemex was like that. Pemex had a higher rating than its sovereign parent, even though the parent owned the company, because they were able to stabilize the investment environment inside Pemex. Now it's exactly the opposite situation. I think we're going to see a lot of, maybe especially with these data center discussions, we're going to see a lot of that happening around the world, where you have kind of chaos, if you like, and then you have firms or subnational governments or collections, clubs that are able to stabilize against that chaos, and the way it'll be reflected is in the lower cost of capital. And if we could reflect that in the models, then that, which I haven't seen done yet, then that would be a really big deal. That's a really, really interesting question. Cool. Okay, I want to just talk briefly about technology. Not all the models, but a lot of the models now have some kind of algorithms where the technologies get better, and they get better at different rates. There's always this problem of the knowability ex ante of the learning rates. How do we know batteries will continue to improve at this rate? How do we know it's solar? Watch what's happening in wind right now. If anything, we're going to see negative learning in wind. So that's kind of tricky to calibrate the models and so on. And that's a perpetual employment program, and I'm glad people are working on that. What I find interesting about technology is the interaction with the politics. So when you bring a new technology into service, this is an RMI chart that I think Kingsmill Bond, who's now at Ember, put together a long time ago. Just shows our kind of standard S-shaped curve. And then as the new technology comes in, its market share starts growing more rapidly, and it gets lots of friends. And so the technology, as it gets better, becomes more powerful politically. And in doing that, it's able to change the rules and change regulations and so on. And basically the new technology is able to beat up on the old technology, not just through better performance, but also by changing the policy environment. So widely documented in lots of different studies and so on. The theory of politics here, which is very interesting, I think, for the IM community, is that basically you have a decline in the cost of technologies that give firms that back that technology a larger market share, more revenue, more political power from that revenue, and then allows them to tilt the policy landscape in their favor. In some sense, the whole field of industrial organization and the study of technology and regulation, going back to a famous paper by George Stigler, is about this. It's about the idea that firms actually love regulation when they can use regulation to manipulate entry into markets and basically change the competitive landscape. And that same logic, I think, applies to clean tech. That there's a political economy of clean tech, where as the technologies get better, they become politically more powerful. They have lobbying groups. They used to view Washington as the enemy. Now they view Washington as a friend, or they view Brussels as a friend, and so on. And then they run a political strategy. A lot of us believed, frankly, that was the theory of politics behind the Inflation Reduction Act. That's why so many of us got it wrong in assuming that the Inflation Reduction Act would mostly survive the transition from Biden to Trump, because there are other theories of politics, fealty to the president and so on, that were much more powerful. But this is, I think, really interesting. To my knowledge, nobody's been able to really put this into the models, but this, in my mind, would be that some theory like this would be a very powerful way to endogenize politics and policies inside the models, such that the models don't just let technology get better and therefore more competitive, but the technology that becomes more competitive and gains larger market share is able to rewrite its policy landscape. The trade community did this with what was called new trade theory, very, very powerful for a while, where basically the trade policies, tariffs and so on, were endogenous to the success and failure of firms that were exposed to trade. And I think that's a big opportunity here in low carbon. Some of us are working on this right now. I'd say we have kind of toy versions of this kind of endogenization, but this would be almost a holy grail. I want to talk briefly about carbon removal. A lot of people are excited about carbon removal. Your company is excited about carbon removal. Lots of people investing in it and so on. And it's a big result in the models. So let me just go back to this chart that we looked at earlier. So this chart is a result of one of the database. I think this is the database that YASA puts together, but it shows all of the credible scenarios for a handful of different IPCC reports. And the big difference is between these scenarios way up here, which are kind of business as usual scenarios where not a lot changes. How you actually do business as usual when you're forecasting 100 years into 80 years in the future, and you couldn't do a good job backcasting 80 years is, a big question. But let's set that aside for the moment. And then these scenarios here are various scenarios that are consistent with these goals of stopping warming at well below 2 degrees. Below 2 degrees, 1.5 degrees. There's no perfect relationship between emissions and the temperature in the atmosphere, because there's uncertainties in the carbon cycle, uncertainties in climate sensitivity, and so on. So this is never expressed as a 1-for-1. This is expressed as a probability of keeping temperatures below some level. Many of these models, because it's so hard to keep temperatures below these levels, these models overshoot. And so almost all the models, not all of them, but almost all of them overshoot a bit and then come back down and so on. I'm happy to talk more about that. But what I want to focus on right now is the intuition. And the intuition is that if it's hard to meet a future climate goal, because there's inertia in the energy system and the cost of emissions controls is really high and so on, then you wait. And as you wait, more carbon goes in the atmosphere. And since carbon is a stock pollutant in the atmosphere, as that carbon accumulates in the atmosphere, it makes it harder and harder, I think actually impossible, to stop warming at 2 degrees, certainly impossible to stop warming at 1.5 degrees and so on. So the models all have this shape where they're working hard to control emissions, but it takes a while. And so emissions go up for a while, and then they come back down, and then they go negative. And these are total net global emissions. So a lot of models, the more stringent the policy goal, nearly always the model concludes that sometime soon we need to actually have net negative emissions in the atmosphere, such that we can pull out of the atmosphere the carbon that was already put up in the atmosphere previously and minimize the overshoot and keep temperature. So that's the intuition behind this. My own view is that the 1.5 degree scenarios and 2 degree scenarios are so ridiculous that they've become almost laughable, and they're forcing these models into regimes that are so implausible that we're kind of drifting away from reality. But the intuition is right, which is the more aggressive you want to be in climate goals, the more valuable carbon removal technologies become. So my team here at Scripps Institute of Oceanography and the Deep Decarbonization Initiative has been spending a lot of time on this question, and I want to show you what our contribution, which is we want to know how different carbon removal technologies, how quickly could they really diffuse into service? Because if you look at these model results, this tells us that there should be a massive carbon removal business already existing in the 2040s and the 2050s and growing rapidly from there. That carbon removal business doesn't actually exist today, which is kind of inconvenient. And so if it doesn't exist today, I mean, it exists in a few, like small projects, science projects, how do you get from the science projects to an industrial scale activity that is pulling ultimately ones to then tens of gigatons, billions of tons of carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere? So how scalable is this? That's what we've been working on. So the way we've been doing it, as we've been saying, there are different carbon removal technologies. And in history, you can look at how technologies like that scale into the marketplace because that reveals to you something about the kinds of factors that slow down or speed up the scalability of the technology. So let me start with an interesting option. This is a paper we published 10 or 11 months ago, something like that, on with a group of soil biologists and some other people and climate modelers, where we looked at the option of growing plants, row crops, corn, soybeans, cotton, sorghum, yada yada yada, growing row crops with a root structure that is engineered to be deeper and to express more suberin in the roots. Suberin's interesting because the roots don't decay as rapidly. So basically, if you combine that with no-till agriculture, you have an option for putting carbon in the soils, not permanently, but semi-permanently, on the scale of decades to maybe centuries. And we've done some work on the interaction between the permanence and the impact on the climate. And so ideally you might want to make a plant, this is a kind of corn plant, that has bigger roots and deeper roots and have no-till agriculture. And then the carbon, while you make corn or maize, the carbon is going into the soils. And the different engineering options shown on the right there have different life cycles of sequestering carbon in the atmosphere. So that's the biology, super interesting. The question though for us is, how quickly can that biology be put into practice? So we went off and did a study on the history of the closest technological analog, which is genetically modified crops. And what you see on this chart here is on the left panel, the fraction of the global crop area by crop, so these are rice, maize, wheat, soybeans, and so on, that are genetically modified, and how over time that genetic modification came into service. So these curves are very steep. The technological change happens fairly quickly, 5-10 years. It doesn't happen in all countries, because some countries are opposed to, many countries are opposed to genetic modification, but some accept it. And so from history, we can learn which countries would be the likely early adopters of these carbon absorbing crops, and how quickly the technology might be able to diffuse into service, because the technology would be added to the existing system of making new seeds and teaching farmers how to use those seeds and things like that. That's the left-hand chart. The right-hand chart is showing the same data, but using country as the unit of analysis. So think of this as crop country as the unit of analysis here, and we're looking to history to guide us for how quickly the technology can come into service. What's super interesting about this option, this carbon removal option, is that it can be diffused into service very, very rapidly, because it's just like a technology that we know how to diffuse into service. Now, the maximum potential is, we think, on the order of a couple billion tons, so that's not zero, but it's not 10, 20 billion tons. This is the fastest carbon removal option we've studied so far. We're studying all clusters. We're doing some work on ocean sequestration, so in particular, enhancing the alkalinity of the oceans. I'm not going to spend time today on the chemistry of this, but basically you can change the alkalinity, the buffering reactions in the oceans, and convince the oceans to absorb potentially massive amounts of carbon semi-permanently, depending on your views about that. But I'm pretty persuaded this can be done effectively semi-permanently by changing the chemistry and then eventually getting the carbon into the deep oceans. How do you do this? You process lots of ocean water, you move a lot of rock around, so you find the rock, you crush the rock, you move it around, and so on. What are industries that are like that? Well, moving a lot of rock around, we do that. There's the sand and gravel industry and so on. Managing a lot of things in near-shore oceans, aquaculture business, desal business, and so on. So these are all industries that took much longer compared to crops, much longer to diffuse into service. Now, you could, with a concerted program, maybe they would accelerate that. We spent some time working on that issue. One last cluster of technologies we spent some time on, which are direct air capture. So these are machines on land that have scrubbers in them, in effect, that take carbon dioxide at low concentration of the atmosphere, 415, 420 parts per million, capture it, and then put it underground, or do something else with it, most likely put it underground. There are some projects approaching scale that are now moving forward. Very, very small industry right now. But we published a paper a few years ago where we said, this looks a lot like chemical synthesis projects or fertilizer plants and so on. How quickly can that industry take off in places that are highly committed, like to run a crash program? And the answer is, it takes decades. Why do we care about this? We care about this because history is not a perfect guide for how quickly the industry can scale up, but it helps constrain what's possible and helps you focus on where you need to overcome the limits of history, and if you really wanted to accelerate introduction of a new technology. The tenor of all of our work that we publish is now 4 papers in this area that we've published. The tenor of all of that is that the algorithms that should be included in the integrated assessment models should slow down the introduction of of carbon removal technologies and do it by technology class. To my knowledge, nobody's yet done this, but it's a fairly easy port into those models, and they will make the models much more pessimistic about stopping warming at 2 degrees. The costs will be higher. And much more realistic, I think, about the extent to which carbon removal technologies can be deployed in the real world. The last thing I want to talk about well, I didn't move the box down, but it's the geography of emissions controls. I want to pause for a second, Greg, and see if there's anything you wanted to say about direct air capture or carbon removal.
Well, the one question is recommendations for how to make it faster. I mean, which risks are you seeing as being what made the previous generations take decades that might be resolved today?
Yeah, it's confidence in market, and it's the scalability. So these crop-based systems are, when I look at where the money is flowing right now, it's flowing into these big engineering systems that history tells us are going to be actually slow to scale. It's flowing into the ocean options, which are interesting and could really scale. I think we have not yet seen the political blowback on that. I'm actually very concerned. I'm very attracted to this as a scientist, very concerned as a political scientist. The crop options are really much more interesting when you think about this as a scaling problem, because they can scale so quickly. And they can scale so quickly in the places that have already demonstrated that they're willing to accept an engineered crop. So I think that's one lesson, is I would be overweighting those options from an investment point of view because the scalability of them are.
So what makes them different? Because I'm seeing, I see size of minimal deployment is much larger in these more industrial things. That's a difference. But the confidence thing I'm not quite seeing yet, because, well, agriculture is food. People should be very afraid of food. Changes.
Well, that's exactly the logic that folks use to say genetically modified foods wouldn't be accepted. Mm-hmm. And then we saw the bifurcation. So with Europe and others, India to some degree, were opposed to genetically modified foods. Other countries actually embraced them. Part of the reason they embraced them, we talk more about this in the paper that we published, is because the way that contracts were set up is they created what's called producer surplus. Mm-hmm. So that the extra value created flowed back, at least in part, to the producers. And so the producers, the farmers, and the seed companies were highly motivated to adopt them. And this is a kind of way of thinking about the political economy of adoption. You could imagine doing the same thing for ocean alkalinity enhancement, for direct air capture, and so on. But it's that paying attention to the way that the benefits flow and how quickly the technology could be adopted and scaled that I think should be weighted to a much greater degree. Right now, for my taste, too much of the whole carbon removal space is being driven by the tech that looks interesting and not enough attention to how quickly the tech can scale.
Right, makes sense.
Yeah. So I think that's the part of it we're working on. Last thing I want to say, and just in my tour of 6 or 7 interesting results or interesting attributes of the IAMs, of the integrated assessment models, when they do deep decarbonization, is to talk about the geography. And the geography of emissions controls originally was assumed that all countries were going to get involved in one way or another. When you think about which countries are actually going to cut emissions, and as a political scientist, one way to think about it, this is from a paper that Bob Cohane and I wrote quite some time ago. We're actually in the middle with Scott Barrett, an economist at Columbia, of doing an update in a couple of papers that are just in draft as of the last few days, is thinking about the structure of the agreements. And one way to think about those agreements is, are the agreements, or the content of the agreement, are they self-enforcing? So meaning every country that signs up to it has an incentive to stay on board, or are they not self-enforcing? Do they require some external enforcement agent? For example, the Europeans are putting into place this carbon border adjustment mechanism that is, in effect, using access to the European market as an enforcement mechanism. And are the gains from collaboration, from countries working together, are they high? Large benefits that they can appropriate, also benefits for the climate, or are they low? Why is this interesting? This is interesting because when you think about the problem of cooperation this way, then you can immediately see what our history has been mostly, which is over here where the potential joint gains are relatively low, and either the agreements were not self-enforcing, they required countries to do things that were not necessarily in their interest, like Kyoto. Kyoto was guaranteed to blow up for that reason, or are plausibly self-enforcing, either because, like, the Framework Convention on Climate Change doesn't have any content, it's just like show up at meetings and file some reports, or Paris is designed so that countries can pick and choose their own pledges and their own commitments and so on. The holy grail for a long time has been right up here. High joint gains that people assume there'll be an incentive to defect from those, and so there needs to be some kind of enforcement mechanism. If you think that what's going on in the world is a shift in the direction to a more chaotic world where enforcement is much harder, then you're going to expect actually most international cooperation to be moving in this direction right here. Smaller groups of countries and firms focused on creating joint gains in a context where the countries and the firms want to stay inside. To the logical extreme on this, the only region in the world that is plausibly set up to put these kinds of deals together is Europe. They're the only place that has reliably cared about climate and been willing to spend its own money to go beyond that, and in effect build clubs of other countries that are willing to do this, and then ultimately a club that probably needs to engage China in one way or another, because their role in clean tech is so important and their role in emissions is so important. As an American, I'm a little horrified to say that I can see all of this emerging in ways that studiously avoid engagement from the United States early on, because we're so unreliable and we're introducing so much chaos in the system. Why is this interesting to those of us who use these integrated assessment models? And I'll stop with this point, and then we can kind of go to broader conversation. I've got a couple other slides that I can showing that. It's interesting because we could use these models to quantify the size of the gains that come from these different climate clubs. A group in Norway and I did this some time ago, where we looked at climate clubs that focused on soot and methane, so short-lived climate pollutants, where it's easier to get the gains because the pollutant is short-lived, and so it doesn't travel very far before it delivers its benefits or its costs to the country. The same can be true for carbon. This is, I think, a really, really interesting opportunity to basically use these models to assess the stability of international cooperation around climate. And all else equal, I think that stability is going to be moving to smaller groups where it's easier to insulate from chaos and easier to concentrate the benefits from joint action inside the firms and the governments that are parts of those groups. So let me just stop there and see if there are other comments or questions, and I can add some things along the way.
Well, the first one would be, what are the benefits of a joint action that's not fully global joint action?
Access to markets. So the place that's, I think, most interesting to watch this right now is how the Europeans are trying to put together an arrangement that engages China and the European auto market. European automakers, actually some of them in China, domestically inside Europe are in deep, deep trouble. And yet there's a huge advantage to having large numbers of electric vehicles come into Europe for climate goals and local air pollution goals and so on. In fact, the new Bloomberg numbers that were released this morning, the bright spot in clean tech investment now is transportation. It's transportation and grids. Renewables are in a bit of trouble, mainly because of the changes in the Chinese power market. But electric vehicles and clean transportation is the really interesting, surface transportation is the really interesting bright spot. So the benefits would be a mixture of climate benefits, but the tangible benefits would be access to markets and the benefits that come from investment and ability to sell product in those markets. There's an interesting opportunity, just one more word on this, a very interesting opportunity for engaging with China around this now, because to the extent that you think the United States is going to, it's a bipartisan support for the United States to beat up on China. As a globalist, I'm horrified by the whole thing. I see it in the classroom. I see it in the investment patterns. I'm horrified by it. But if you think that's built into American politics for the future, for the foreseeable future, then that narrows China's options for access to markets and forces them to become more dependent on some large emerging economies, think Brazil, and on many of the middle powers, think Canada, and on Europe. And so it creates a big advantage for countries that want to have some regulated access to their market for Chinese products, and also want to make sure this is done in some way that's good for the climate. That's one way to interpret what's going on with the Chinese, with the European-Chinese auto deals. Canada just reached one with China, which is the same kind of arrangement. Regulated or managed access to the Canadian electric vehicle market. There's a lot of things going on there. You know, it's not just climate by any stretch of the imagination. But the point is that then those are the kinds of benefits that you would be able to calculate.
Okay, and what role does I guess fear of somebody else being ahead of you before some serious laws come online? I guess expectation of future laws.
Yeah, so it is a huge role. Chuck Sable and I have a book out a couple years ago on how society solve problems when there's a strong motivation to act and nobody knows what to do. Mm-hmm. Our logic in that book is about what we call experimentalism, that basically firms and governments that are fearful of being seen as dragging their feet or fearful of being left behind, that those firms go off and they invest in experiments and they figure out what's possible and they stabilize the market, and then they develop rules around that. I think that's a genuine explanation of how the world really works. That's how we solve the ozone problem. That's how we're working on clean tech for data centers, like all kinds of stuff. So we see that over and over and over again. I don't know how to bring that intuition in a useful way into the integrated assessment models, because there's too many moving parts to turn it into a code that could be used in a useful way inside the integrated assessment models. But maybe there are other people thinking about that problem in a different way, and they could make some progress on that way. So basically, you have the model firms and governments would see, there'd be some frontier of firms and governments that would see a risk of getting hammered by being late to the party or being seen as dragging their feet, and that would motivate them to do things beyond what the kind of normal costs of benefits would predict. That could be very interesting.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. Thank you. Did you want to take more questions, or do the last few slides?
Why don't you, more questions? I've got a few slides that I can, but my guess is that slides would be more useful in the response to questions.
Actually, any other questions in the call?
I don't see any questions. Okay, why don't I just talk then? Okay, so I want to make a couple final observations. The first is that capital is key. Of all the things that I've talked about today, the place where, with reasonable effort, studying the financial markets, you could continue to make a large impact on improving the realism of the integrated assessment models is improving capital. I mean, we have this really stunning result. This is the data that I was talking about earlier, where the clean tech revolution is continuing on for a whole bunch of reasons. It's mainly in renewable energy, in transportation, which is now the #1 source of clean tech, and in electric power grids. And in fact, when you break all the clean tech investment into two categories, on the left-hand side, we're going to look at things where the business model is mature. The dominant ones, there clean tech continues to grow. And on the right-hand side, much smaller scale, are places where the emerging sectors where the business model is not mature. CCS, most of CCS, still frankly a lot of nuclear, certainly new nuclear. Electrified heat may be getting better. Hydrogen just continues to get hammered, and so on. And what you see in the actual investment is this bifurcation between places where the risks are relatively low and large volumes of capital that is not all speculative equity can be deployed into clean technology. And on the right-hand side, you see a lot of science projects in a lot of trouble. And in fact, science projects where they're incredibly sensitive to the policy environment, to the stability of the policy environment. So in some places, they're continuing forward. Think about the methanol ships, the dual fuel methanol ships, where despite all the chaos in the International Maritime Organization, European firms, Maersk in particular, are pushing ahead and see a big increase in those kinds of orders. But they're very, very sensitive to the policy environment. Why do we care about this? We care about this because I think there's a big opportunity to look at the varieties of clean tech industry all around the world. And This is some work that published a couple weeks ago from Brookings, where I've laid out a framework for thinking about this. Let me just say a couple words about this, what this means for the climate modeling community. You can think about the role of government in creating a technological revolution in two ways. One is government paying for it? And the other way is, are they orchestrating? Are they running a kind of industrial policy where they're telling different firms how to link with each other and things like that? So this is a 2x2 matrix here. The classic Chinese model is, or the classic model in China is, they pay for it and they orchestrate this inside the in the economy. The old American model, Inflation Reduction Act, for example, and so on, was we paid a lot, but we didn't engage in orchestrating too much of the economy, within reason. The new American model is at the federal level, is a kind of chaos and instability and so on. The European model is up in the upper right-hand corner. Why do we care about this? We care about this because the business model around clean and about stabilizing against chaos is going to vary by where you are in the world. There's a literature in comparative politics called the Varieties of Capitalism literature. It's about how different countries organize their capitalism in different ways, and that leads to different kinds of outcomes. And I think we're now on the cusp of being able to do a varieties of clean set of analyses where different countries have different kinds of ways of organizing the interaction between government and business. This has really, really big implications for the United States, because the clean tech revolution in the United States is not dead. What's happened is it's moving in the direction of places where firms and states can stabilize it against the chaos, where either the technology is already in the money or the policy support can be stabilized against the chaos at the federal level. That is the same thing is happening in many emerging economies. Think about the solar revolution in India, which has thrived, especially in places where it can be removed from the grid or insulated from the chaos of the grid-related policies. The last thing I want to say, last slide I want to show, and sorry, show one more slide, is about confidence. I want to come kind of back full circle. What's happened in the energy analysis community is that as we've had more models and been able to produce charts like the one I showed in the very beginning, we have thousands of scenarios, and you're comparing the scenarios, there's become a kind of almost sociological pressure to have results that are comparable with the next person's results. And so you can figure out in detail why your numbers are different from that person's numbers and so on. And there's a value of that when you're doing model inter comparisons. But it has also meant that the whole literature in this field is overweighted around things for which we have very high confidence, things where we really know the exact result of this variable on that result. And the place where I've experienced this in the most extreme form is in the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, where we have specific language actually that we use when we make a conclusion, and we talk about the confidence with which we have the conclusion. And I was a convening lead author for one of the chapters for 6 or 7 years in the IPCC. And I came out of that experience very worried about this obsession with confidence, that most of what we write about and we tell policymakers about are things for which we have high confidence. And so at the end of that experience, I went off and I counted up the number of statements in the IPCC reports that are statements about confidence. And this is what you see on this chart here. What you see is, and there's 5 kinds of confidence, from very, very high confidence, which is actually a very hard standard to meet, so we don't say that really at all, high confidence statements, all the way down to low confidence statements and so on. The system is overweighting in the direction of high confidence statements, things around which we really think we know what we're talking about. Everything that I've talked about today is in the realm of low confidence, high importance, but low confidence. We don't really know how to model exactly the inclusion of the capital markets. We don't know how to model the role of uncertainty or the motivation of a firm to go invest in some new technology because it's worried about being left behind. And yet that's where all the real action is in the real world. And that's where I think the highest value is going to come, from pushing the models to learn new tricks. And so if you find yourself, those of you who are doing this kind of modeling, if you find yourself focusing on things where you have extremely high confidence in what the model is doing, then stop. Go work on something that's important, certainly, but also an area where you have much lower level of confidence, because that's where most of the progress is going to be made. Thank you.
Paul, yeah, thank you very much. So then let me ask you probably the last statement you had before on the role of private versus public activity. To what extent is private incentive important? Because usually individuals have to pay for an activity, but they don't. I mean, of course, they benefit from decarbonization, the big picture, but individually, if they just get enough money, they're fine, right? So the incentives are a bit off for individuals, but a lot of this stuff has to be executed by individuals with private incentives. So how do you manage that?
Well, I think there are two ways of doing this. One is exactly as you've summarized, which is we should go look at places where there's confidence in the policy incentive or in the payment or whatever. There's a very interesting disconnect between the theoretical literature and the real world here, which is the theoretical literature mostly has said for decades, and not wrongly, that we need to have what are called sticks, so carbon taxes that come to emissions, or caps on emissions, and so on, and that's what's going to motivate the economy to go do stuff. When you look at the real world, almost all the policies, not all, but almost all the policies, certainly the strong weight of policy support in this area is not in the sticks area. It's in carrots, it's in direct subsidies and industrial policy and so on. So first, pay attention to the flow of money back into whoever is going to do this investment. But the second is, I'm actually pretty impressed by how much clean tech investment is happening by firms that are doing this because they're thinking a few steps down the game tree. They're thinking about the future policy environment. The place where this is probably most visible today certainly is in the data center build out, where you see a lot of firms willing to pay a lot more than the $45 a megawatt hour that they'd be spending on natural gas burned in a gas turbine, because they are worried about the having their emissions under control, and they're worried about what the future might be if they're seen as not taking the emissions problem seriously.
So for this one, actually, usually you would expect the exact opposite, because stock markets with their quarterly returns and quarterly stock price fluctuations tend to reward CEOs with short-term gains. This is a good example of long-term thinking. For like 10 years from now, people are going to be mad at my company. I guess, where do you see the dynamics going towards shorter-term thinking and longer-term, or some weird hybrid?
Yeah, so I think, so it's a big question, very, very important question. I guess I see this as a little bit of an antidote against the incredible pessimism that people have when the federal government, this country, becomes flaky about climate policy. Climate policy doesn't fall off a cliff. You don't even see it in the new. Don't even see it in the new Bloomberg data out this morning for just the U.S. The renewables are about flat. Wind is going to take a real hammering for a bunch of reasons. Solar play is really pretty impressive, and so on. So I see it partly. This is an antidote. I also think it's really important to distinguish between what you need in order to get technologies through the science project and a few early projects, and what you need to scale. What you're ultimately going to need to scale more widely is going to be some kind of price incentive, some mixture of carrots and sticks, subsidies and penalties for emissions. Otherwise, it's the clean technologies become stuck as a boutique industry. And I think we see this right now with carbon removal is a good example of this. Frankly, to some degree, the small modular reactor is a good example of this. Lots of kind of pseudo projects where there's a little capital behind them, but everyone's waiting to figure out what scales with basic incentives.
Okay, and then in terms of technology deployment, I guess, what barrier do you see for actually doing a lot of stuff? So some of these things are the granularity of the smallest plant you can build, we discussed earlier. But these are large logistical systems. So in terms of setting up the entire logistical chain of, actually, I'm thinking hydrogen. That's a nasty logistical chain, whereas liquid fuels are a similar one because it's a smaller change. So to what extent is knowledge and ability to change logistics a big deal for these transitions?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't really fully know the answer to that question. I certainly haven't seen that reflected in any of the models. Hydrogen and clean molecules are really interesting examples here. So on the hydrogen side, the challenges, in particular on the electrolyzers, the challenges with all of that have meant that the rest of the supply chain has really been waiting and seeing whether the policy environment and the investment environment around hydrogen is going to be real. And for the most part, the last few years of waiting have revealed that it's not. And so you see that in the top level numbers. I'm wary about assuming the clean molecules space is any simpler, actually. We do a lot of work in aviation, contrail avoidance, and so on, trying to understand that. None of it's relevant for the integrated assessment models. it's hard enough to get carbon right in the models. Contrails is a totally different story. But in the course of doing that, I spent a fair bit of time with people who are in the sustainable aviation fuel industry, and in particular the next generation sustainable aviation fuel industry, the conventional sustainable aviation fuel, recycled fryer oils and stuff like that. So that's boring. And it scales up to a point. But what's really interesting is ESAF and so on. And the logistics there could be very, very complicated. There's a lot of people doing really interesting projects. The risks there are really pretty significant, and the key is the offtake arrangements.
Right. Just it's called consistency across the value chain. Yeah. All right. Well, cool. Yeah. Thank you very much. This was fascinating.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation. Great to be with you and to learn how to do a presentation in Google Meet.
Yes.
It's been new for me. Thank you, Greg.
Thank you. All right. Bye.